Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight to take part in our special program, True Stories and Folk Tales in the Old West, the Earps, a la Earps, celebrating the publication of Ann Kirschner's new book, Lady at the Corral, the True Story of Josephine Marcus Earp. My name is Marcel. I'm a librarian at the ASU Library. When Ann published her previous book, Sally's Gift, about her mother's Holocaust story, we invited her to give a public presentation in the library on the NTP campus. That evening was the best attended public program on record at the ASU Library. We actually had to turn people away. Some of you remember that, for the lack of space. This is why we looked for a venue that can accommodate a larger audience for this evening, focused on Arizona history. The beautiful building of the Arizona Jewish Historical Society was just it, and we are grateful to be here. To scholarly discuss the always hot OK Corral affair and the woman who shaped the legend of Wyatt Earp and the Wild West, we invited acclaimed historians to join us. I'm pleased to welcome all three guests. Dr. Ann Kirschner, a writer and the University Dean of Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York, named one of New York Magazine's Millennium New Yorkers and honored as a distinguished graduate of Princeton University and University of Buffalo. She serves on several boards of directors, including the Princeton University Graduate School Leadership Council and the Jewish Women's Archive. Dr. Eduardo Pagán, the Bob Stump Endowed Professor of History at ASU, an expert on the American West who also serves as co-host for History Detectives, the popular program of Wyatt. He is currently working on a new book on Arizona's Pleasant Valley War. And Dr. Bruce Dinges, Director of Publication of the Arizona Historical Society, a longtime panelist for the Pima County Public Library's Southwest Books of the Year, and editor-in-chief for the Journal of Arizona History. Before we start, I'd like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank the ASU Libraries for its tremendous support, especially University librarian Sherry Schmidt, as well as Jennifer Duvernay and Amy Watson from the library's Marketing and Outreach Office, Dawn Gison and Eileen Singer from ASU's Jewish Studies, and a wonderful host, the Arizona Jewish Historical Society, and its director, Dr. Larry Bell.
Microphone extra. So anyway, I just want to welcome everybody to the center. And I know some of you had not been here before, so in 2 seconds, this was the very first synagogue that was built in Phoenix, this room. And on the wall right behind Raquel is a picture of this room in 1926. You're free to browse around after the program. It later became a Chinese-speaking and a Spanish-speaking Baptist church. And now it is the Cutler Clock and Jewish Heritage Center. It is a place, educational center, museum, cultural center, open to people of any faith. Everybody's welcome to attend programs here. And as you go, you're welcome to take any of the literature on those tables, except the books. The books are for sale, but all the rest of it is free. Take it. Please feel free to attend our programs. We have a wonderful musical concert this Sunday by Jeffrey Siegel, who's a renowned pianist, and he'll be playing a classical musical concert for us. It's a fundraiser. And there are still tickets available to that, and if you're interested, there's information over there. With that, I'm going to cut the self-promotion, and I'll turn it over to our esteemed panel. And thank you all for coming and doing this program. And Raquel, thank you for putting this together. I wish I could take credit for this program, but it really is all Raquel Leckett-Moore, who's the ASU Jewish Studies librarian, who put this program together. We're just hosting it for you. So with that, here you go.
Thank you. I'm just going to sit for a minute or two and read you the opening of my book, and then I'll get up and walk around. So let me also start by saying thank you very, very much to all of you for coming and to this, having us in this extraordinary space, and for Raquel for putting us all together in the right place. Since Arizona is an extraordinarily important part of the story, it's very special to be here. And it makes me think of one of my favorite lines from Owen Wister's The Virginian, which is, "Arizona is not for amateurs." So let's keep that in mind tonight. So let me just read you the first couple of pages from the prologue to my book, in which I land on planet Earp. Did you know that Wyatt Earp was buried in a Jewish cemetery? Just hearing his name threw me back to my childhood in Jackson Heights, New York City, sprawled on the floor in front of a black and white television watching Westerns with my big brother Joey, dressed up in his special shirt with braided trim and snazzy snap buttons and black cowboy hat and shiny gun in a faux leather holster slung around his hips. Joey and I tuned in and pretended to walk the streets of Tombstone every week, together with millions of Americans, young and old. Joey was my hero, and Marshall Earp was his. Brave, courageous, bold, and Jewish. So that's how it all started, just an innocent question from a friend who thought correctly that I would be intrigued by the incongruities between anything Jewish and anything Tombstone-ish. This first burst of curiosity about Wyatt Earp's final resting place of religion was easily satisfied. I soon learned that Wyatt was not Jewish, but had lived with a Jewish woman for nearly 50 years, and she buried him next to her parents and her brother in a family plot at the synagogue-affiliated Hills of Eternity Cemetery outside of San Francisco. And that was my introduction to Mrs. Earp. I think I will stop there. And what I want to do is kind of take you on a little bit of a travelogue, which is, I feel like, Nancy Sinatra or something. Take you on a little bit of a travelogue in my experiences in putting together the book as I went around the country following Josephine and Wyatt. So there's my brother Joey, and that's me, the little baby over there. It's funny, recently I discovered that all those years when we were watching Wyatt Earp, we could also have been watching Annie Oakley. Only this was the days before DVR and my brother controlled the remote control. So, in fact, there were no remote controls. You went up and, exactly. So I didn't even know that there was a television show about Annie Oakley because Joey wouldn't have let me watch that. So, my first book, as Rachel mentioned, was about my mother. My mother's a Holocaust survivor and really bears absolutely no resemblance to Josephine Earp in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, when I started working on this book, I thought, well, good, I'll get my head out of World War II and out of the world of the Holocaust, which I've lived with for a very long time. Little did I know that in figuring out the story of Josephine Earp, I would be brought back to Europe and understanding a little bit of 19th century history, because Josephine's family was from this region of Posen, which is the eastern part of the Prussian Empire, and this area right below it, Silesia, is where my mother is from. So at the end of the day, I really didn't get all that far from this area of Europe. Josephine Marcus's family came from that region, from Posen, which is today in Poland, but of course Poland didn't exist then. And they came to the United States around 1850 and settled, as many Jewish immigrants did, in New York City. They did not prosper particularly in New York City, but they stayed there throughout the Civil War. Josephine was born in 1860. And then after the Civil War, when it was okay to move around the United States again, they were reading, as many people were, about the West. They were reading about San Francisco and all the wonderful things that were happening in the Jewish community in San Francisco. And so they took a second immigration hop, and they went to San Francisco. They went by steamer. They went through Panama and then up the western coast of the United States. and arrived in San Francisco, which had a very, very bustling Jewish community. But like a lot of Jewish communities, it was sort of stratified, with the German Jews at the higher end, and all the other Jews, especially the Jews who spoke Yiddish and were less educated, the Jews who were from that Posen area, they were at the lower end. And this didn't sit very well with our Josephine, who had a young girl's sense of adventure and a sense that great things were ahead of her in life. And so the idea that she might be treated as a second-class citizen in the San Francisco of 1880 did not sit well with Josephine. And she decided, oh, yeah, look at those pictures. I'll cover that one up. So we don't actually know what young Josephine looked like, because there are no authenticated pictures of young Josephine. And I am 80% sure that the picture on the left, which is very often identified as her, is not her. I would say 60% sure that the picture on the right is her. But I can't be sure of that because the provenance of these pictures is sort of doubtful. But what we do know is that Josephine was a very beautiful woman, and we know that because she was constantly attracting the attentions of men. She was small, she was dark, and from the New York Times review of my book, I learned a new word, which is the word quatrain, which is a very polite way of saying that she was stacked. The New York Times really just gave me a new way of describing it, because quatrain sounds a lot better than stacked, right? So Josephine had been sent by her parents to dancing school, and as was common with young girls at the time. And this was an era, that's not Josephine, by the way, I'll tell you who that is in a minute. Josephine didn't have a tremendous amount of talent, but this was an era when the HMS Pinafore craze was sweeping America. Every town had to have their own HMS Pinafore production. And many of these productions were touring throughout the Arizona territory. And they were desperate for actors, for singers, and for dancers. And so Josephine decided that she could do this. And around 1879, she ran away from home. She was a teenager, and she decided, this would be a great adventure, and off she went. And it was part of the Pauline Markham troupe, and this is Pauline up there. You can see over here at the left an advertisement for the Pauline Markham troupe going to Arizona. And so Josephine goes off to Arizona to become an actress. While she's there, a sort of second-rate politician named Johnny Bean takes one look at Josephine and thinks she's pretty cool, and asks her to come to the bustling, exciting new boomtown of Tombstone to be his bride. And Josephine thinks she's in love, and so off she goes to Tombstone. So Tombstone, there's Johnny Bean over there on the right-hand side. So our cast of characters is beginning to gather in Tombstone. In 1879, Wyatt Earp and his brothers arrive in Tombstone. All of them have wives, common law wives, as was quite common at the frontier. And Wyatt is there with his common law wife, Mattie Blaylock. They actually arrived in Tombstone pretty much the same time. One of the interesting things I always find about thinking about this story is that Josephine arrives in Tombstone by stagecoach. And by the end of her life, she's dying till 1944. Of course, we're in the era of planes, trains, and automobiles. So think about how America changed over the course of her lifetime. So there the Earps are gathered in Tombstone, and Josephine lives there first with Johnny Bean, but she very quickly discovers that she has made a bad choice. Johnny Bean is a dirty dog. He has no intention of making Josephine his wife. He would much rather have her look after his young son, and he's very quickly cheating on her. So there's Josephine, ready to leave Johnny Bean, and what's a woman not particularly talented, not extremely well educated, and not wanting to go home and admit that she's not done so well in Tombstone. Josephine is pretty adrift for some period of time in Tombstone. And it's during this time that I believe she caught the eye of Wyatt Earp. He and Johnny Bean were political rivals. They both wanted to be the first sheriff of Cochise County. But it was Johnny Bean who won that election. But it was Wyatt Earp who ended up with Josephine. So the gunfight at the OK Corral, there's probably a lot of people in this room who know a lot about the gunfight at the OK Corral. And if you don't, by the way, the next time you're at a cocktail party and someone says something about the gunfight at the OK Corral, make sure you tell them that it didn't actually happen at the OK Corral. It happened in the alley next to it, and you'll make yourself very popular at cocktail parties. So I'm not going to go through all the permutations of the gunfight at the OK Corral, except to say that most of what you will read will talk about the political and economic and environmental roots of this most famous American battle. But what it won't tell you is that Josephine had a lover on both sides. And I just don't think we can leave that out. The Cowboys, the Clantons and the McClarys were very good friends with Johnny Bean. That was one side of the gunfight of the OK Corral. And then on the other side of the OK Corral, you had Wyatt and his two brothers and Doc Holliday. So not to take anything away from all the other issues leading up to the gunfight at the OK Corral, but it was also a love triangle. So after the gunfight at the OK Corral, Wyatt packed Maddie Blaylock off to his parents. I actually think that was the most cowardly thing that Wyatt Earp ever did, was to send Maddie Blaylock back to his parents when he really had no intention of ever seeing her again, because Wyatt, from there on, was really focused on Josephine. So from 1882 until Wyatt's death in 1929, Wyatt Earp and Josephine were rarely apart for more than a couple of days. They had an extraordinary life. They lived very much in the now. They had no permanent homes. They traveled all the time. A lot of what they did, especially in the latter part of their life, was travel between the California desert, which they loved, Oakland, where Josephine's family lived, and Los Angeles, where they spent the summers. And I've been to many of those places. Probably the one that I found the most interesting was Nome, Alaska, where Wyatt and Josephine spent 3 summers and 1 winter. Anybody in this room ever been to Nome, Alaska? Oh, good. 2, 3, 4 people. Okay. Anybody over here? 4 people. I think that's the most I've ever had in one room. It's really an extraordinary place. It's as isolated as you could possibly imagine. It's right under the Arctic Circle. If you get a refrigerator delivered in Nome, you get it via plane because you can't drive into Nome. So it's only accessible from the Bering Sea by steamer in the summer or by plane. And the extraordinary thing that happened in Nome, which made it one of the most talked about places in the world in the summer of 1900, is that gold was discovered, and of course gold had been discovered in Alaska, but in Nome, the gold was right on the Bering on the Bering Sea, right in the sand. You didn't have to dig. You just had to go out with a little pan and gold would appear. It was like magic. And so tens of thousands of people descended on this tiny little fishing village in the summer of 1900. You can see them here massing in Seattle, getting ready to come to Nome. Josephine and Wyatt made a lot of money in Nome, not from gold, but from what Wyatt would call mining the miners, from all the things that Wyatt always made his money on: saloon keeping, gambling, prostitution. And when they left Nome, they had the equivalent of well over $1 million, enough to live on comfortably if they were careful, but careful was not a word in their vocabulary. So they kept moving. This is a picture of them in their summer camp. I have been there. It is also a very isolated place. And I think it's one of the interesting characteristics of Josephine, that she loved luxury, she loved fancy hotels, but she also loved living in the desert with Wyatt and their little dog, Earpy. Actually, this picture is from Arizona Historical Society, right? I think this is one of yours. The frontier kept being redefined. They lived in boom towns where the frontier was all about mining minerals, gold, silver, copper. They lived in San Diego, where the boom town was all about real estate. And then in the 1920s, they began spending more and more time in LA, where the frontier was about the creation of Hollywood. And you were moving from real cowboys and real lawmen to celluloid characters. They were popular members of the early Hollywood community. There's Tom Mix and William S. Hart, who were both very good friends of theirs. Wyatt was famous in his own time, and Josephine lived with tremendous fear that some of the skeletons in their closet would come back to haunt them. What were the skeletons that she worried most about? Well, she didn't want anybody to know that she had lived in Tombstone as Mrs. Johnny Bean before she took up with Wyatt. So that was one tremendous fear that she had. The second fear that she had, which was even greater, was that anybody would find out that Wyatt had a wife when he came to Tombstone, Mattie Blaylock, and that after Mattie Blaylock left his parents' house, and she was a woman without any money, no education to fall back on, she became a prostitute, a drug addict, and eventually killed herself, cursing Wyatt at the time of her suicide. So these were the skeletons. This was sort of the hoofbeats of Tombstone that Josephine was most concerned about. And so shaping his legend so that you would be sitting here today thinking about Wyatt Earp, brave, courageous, and bold, and not Wyatt Earp, going on a vendetta, murderous rage, or leaving Mattie Blaylock to kill herself. That was very much a focus of the latter part of her life. So Wyatt, to the end of his days, was really a very handsome man. Josephine, on the other hand, it's hard to see the temptress of Tombstone in this picture. She didn't age quite as well as Wyatt did. But they stayed together all those years, and when Wyatt died in 1929, it was a national news story, and it was the most difficult crisis of Josephine's life. This is a picture of the pallbearers at his funeral. Josephine continued to try and shape his legend to make sure that only good stories were told about Wyatt. And she had one public relations triumph in the 1930s that I think is absolutely critical to understanding what happened to our understanding of Wyatt Earp. And that is the famous Arctic explorer Lincoln Ellsworth came to Josephine and said, "I'd like to name my ship the Wyatt Earp, ship that's going to the Antarctica. I'd like to create a little shrine in the captain's cabin. And so he went to Josephine. Josephine gave him one of Wyatt's shotguns, a pair of his last glasses, a copy of one of the first biographies of Wyatt Earp. And for a period of months, the good ship Wyatt Earp was plowing through the seas, and Lincoln Ellsworth was actually lost at sea for several weeks. And this was a front page story in the New York Times. For days on end, you would read about the Wyatt Earp in the New York Times. And so I think it had the effect of sort of polishing up Wyatt's image. And that made Josephine think, well, maybe I'll write my own memoir. And there's Josephine over on the left. You can see she's slimmed down a little. And she began to collaborate with some of Wyatt's distant relatives to tell her own story. But the closer they came to the real story of Tombstone, the closer they came to trying to figure out Johnny Bean, Mattie Blaylock, all of these parts of the story, the more nervous she became, until finally she put an end to the story. She did go back to Tombstone with them. But eventually she said, you know what, we're gonna put this manuscript aside, we're gonna burn it, and I'm gonna put a curse on anybody who tries to, I know, you're old, but move back a few feet after you hear that. I've decided there's a statute of limitations on curses, so I'm not so nervous about that. In her later days, Josephine became increasingly paranoid. She began stalking one of Wyatt's best friends, really one of her best friends too, John Flood, and he began recording some of the paranoid ravings. And this is one where Josephine came to his door and poked her fist through his screen door and said, "I'll get back at you good and hard." And then Flood dated it at the bottom. So Josephine was increasingly difficult in her later years. She also was hurting badly for money. Whatever money they had from Alaska was long gone. When Josephine died, it was not a national news story. In fact, she died and there was no money to pay for her funeral, and so William S. Hart and Sidney Grauman, who had been her friend in Alaska, paid for her funeral expenses. There was a rabbi who officiated at her cemetery. Like Wyatt, she was cremated, and then like Wyatt, she was buried next to her parents and her brothers in that same cemetery outside of Colma. So I think I'd like to end there. And just say that you can't really tell the story of America, tell the story of American history without understanding the frontier. You can't talk about the frontier without talking about Wyatt Earp, about the gunfight at the OK Corral. These are all stories that have struck really deep roots into the American psyche. But you also can't tell those stories without putting the women back in the picture. And to me, Josephine is just one of those women whose story really deserves to be told. So with that, I'm going to sit down, hopefully without killing myself, and join my colleagues over here for what I hope will be a discussion, and then we'll turn it over to you for questions. Thank you.
Goes on. In the interest of full disclosure, I grew up in a little town in Illinois, and I used to go down to Macomb and go through Monmouth, and I'd go past the Wyatt Earp liquor store on the other side of the tracks. And I grew up about 5 miles from Wildville Hickok's hometown, Detroit Road. And like Ann, I really wasn't impressed with this thing because I grew up with Joe O'Brien and meeting you, O'Brien was saying earlier, I think meeting you, O'Brien, was, one time was a bigger thrill to me than I actually met Wyatt Earp because he was the real thing. That said, I think that when one of our earliest meetings, and I expressed some doubt that it was possible to write a biography of Josephine Earp, and I'd just be kind of interested if you could take us quickly through Planet Earp and how you actually put together the story of Josephine.
Well, when you talk about Josephine, first you have to sort of wade through all the stuff that isn't true. Josephine really didn't want her story to be told, and so she put a lot of obstacles in our path and a lot of falsehoods in our path. So you have to kind of, in telling her story, you have to triangulate between what she said, what other people said, and then the facts as you can get them from newspaper accounts or the work of other historians. Probably the biggest break that I got was that there was one collector who had the largest group of letters of Josephine that had not been read, and I had access to those letters. So there was an unfiltered connection. It was a way to hear Josephine in her own voice and be able to develop a picture of her. So that was probably the biggest break that I had. But I also became friendly with a fellow some of you may know named Glenn Boyer. And Glenn had the manuscript of Josephine's memoir, which is today in the archives of the Fort County Historical Society in Dodge. Glenn died just actually a week before my book was published. And until his death, you needed his permission to see the manuscript in Dodge City. So I spent a week there reading that. So, you know, historical sources were incredibly important, but I would say that the thing that really made me feel like I was getting Josephine were her letters.
You know, you partially anticipated my question. And I want to just start off by saying that it's an honor to sit with Ann and Bruce as well, for various reasons, fellow Bristolian. But Bruce, actually, when I started off my graduate work, this was a source of inspiration for me. So it's a pleasure to be sitting with the two of you. I want to ask you a little bit more about the process. And I hope you all appreciate the enormously difficult task that Ann has undertaken. Not only is she aimed straight for the heart of this mythology of the West, right? And really diving into the story of the Earps. But she's had to peel past all these layers of mythology and interpretation, and then discover a woman who did not want to be discovered, and then bring her back to the narrative in human terms. Those three feats in themselves are no small things, so I really applaud what you did. But I want to come back to this question of process. So you've got, as a writer, and I'm going through the same thing myself in writing about Pleasant Valley War, and equally mythologized and storied confrontation in territorial Arizona. You've got this massive information about Josephine, about Wyatt as well. Now, at some point as an author, there's a story you want to tell. Right? There's a narrative that you want to tell about the life of Josephine Earp herself. How do you decide what of these different sources to listen to and what to put in the background? Because, as you know, and if you've read the book, there are completely opposite views about Josephine. She was a nice person, she was an evil person. I mean, there was no in-between, it seemed. And so, at some point, you as a writer had to make the call, this is what I will put up front, and this is what I will kind of put to the side. How do you make that decision?
It's hard. I did know one person who actually knew Josephine, and that's Walt Kaysen, who is the son of the Earp relative with whom Josephine worked on that memoir. And so I did get to see Josephine through the eyes of someone who actually knew her, and that was tremendously helpful. But I would come back again to the letters as the one place where there was unmediated access to the personality of the human being that you're trying to write about. And let me give you an example. So there were those who say that Wyatt and Josephine only stayed together because she had some secrets on him, and if he didn't keep her around, then she was going to out him, somehow. And I'm thinking to myself, Wyatt Earp, so he stayed with this woman for 48 years because she had some dirty secret on dirty pictures or something? I mean, it kind of didn't make sense. And then you read Josephine's letters, and what you hear is the voice of a woman who loves her husband. Doesn't mean, I've been married, actually I'm about to celebrate my 40th wedding anniversary in a couple of weeks, okay? It takes a lot to keep a couple together that long, and you don't do it without love and laughter and respect. It's not coercion. So part of the way I put that together was, first of all, to say it's not logical. It's just not logical. And then the other part of it is, listen to the voice of this woman talking about her husband. And what do you hear? And what I heard was anxiety for his welfare, furiousness at his enemies, ready to do battle on his behalf, and a great deal of love. So to me, it was pretty easy to blow away, the shrew image of Josephine and try and get to what I thought was a really powerful love story.
Can I do a follow-up? Sure. Okay, so I want to probe that notion that she loved her husband. And the reason why is because of the myth makers out there, Josephine was front and center in managing and creating the myth of Wyatt Earp. And there was a point in my reading your work where I had to stand back and ask myself, did she love Wyatt or did she love the myth? Because she wrote that myth and continued to argue that myth and threaten anyone who would challenge that myth. Do you think she really loved the individual or the myth, or what he could have been?
I think she loved Wyatt, and she saw a man with faults and wanted the outside world not to see those faults. So I think what she saw was the same balance of good and not so good that we all have in us. But she recognized she had to be a very modern understanding of celebrity, and she understood that in the minds of the public, complicated stories are too hard to tell. So keep it simple. Make him, put the white hat on his head, and don't confuse anybody with the ambiguities. And so that was the story that she wanted to tell. But she lived with the man, not with the legend.
Okay.
I'll tell you a secret. I know Ann's wedding anniversary is October 28th, and you can kick me if you want, but the reason is when I read the manuscript, every time we came to the Gunfight at the OK Corral, Ann had written, which was October 26th, had written October 28th, so she never completely lost herself in the story.
Thank God for expert readers who will save you from huge embarrassment.
Those exactly, I should just say that all of us know that those are exactly the sorts of things that happen. I know the first paragraph of my doctoral dissertation, my subject's wordplace wrong. And I knew perfectly what it was, but it was the last thing I wrote was the introduction. So this is what always trips me up in the religion today. So, but I wanted to get back to the topic too. I really, when I was asked to do a blurb on this, which I was really happy to do because, like Eduardo says, it's an incredible book. And I wrote that I loved Josephine together with Libby Custer and with Jessica Fremont. And I have to admit, when I looked at it the second time, there's no way that these women would have ever known each other, and if they would have had nothing to talk about to each other. But then the more I thought about it, in a bizarre kind of way, they do fit. And my question is, what was it in these sort of 19th century women who were able to kind of immerse themselves in men who in some respects didn't quite measure up to their wives.
I think you have to look at the era for what it was. You know, this was not an era where women had the range of choices they have now. You know, when you play that game, if you could go back in time and live in another era, what era would you want to live in? Well, you know, the reality is that for women, you kind of don't want to go back a whole lot because we have, right, Rudy? Right? Yes. Because we have a range of choices now that we didn't have before. So I think that, hey, you know, think about Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan. I mean, there's lots of examples of women who saw the flaws in their men. But didn't want the outside world to see them. Were they stronger, better, you know, whatever than the men? And in some cases they were, but the world didn't give them the opportunity to be forward.
You know, I wonder, following up on that, and this is not to harp the point, but I'm struck though that on the other side of it, I agree with you that each of these historical figures were invested in perpetuating a certain type of effort. But on the other side of that, though, the thing that's remarkable about Josephine is that she wanted to become lost to history. And that moves her to a different plane in my mind. There's something else going on there, which, again, really gave me pause. It's one thing to really want the world to embrace your spouse, she or he. It's quite another thing to completely then disappear.
Efface yourself.
Yes.
It's true. And I can think of two reasons for that. The first was she really was afraid of scandal. She really was afraid that you would think she was a bad person in an era when, you know, I talked before about gambling, prostitution, saloon keeping, whatever. By the end of their life together, you were in the era of prohibition. Gambling wasn't legal anymore. I mean, America had gotten very straight-laced. And Josephine was terribly afraid of scandal. So part of the reason that she wanted to quietly disappear was because she was afraid that the real story would come out. I think there's something else going on here, and this is something that, you know, I sort of saw through my mother's eyes as well when I wrote my first book, and that is the feeling I am not worthy. You know, my story isn't important. I'm just a woman in this, you know, caught up in history, and I'm just not important. And I think, you know, there's a writer named Carolyn Heilbrunn who's written it's an old book at this point called Writing Women's Lives that's all about this sense of a room of one's own and the need for women to feel that their story is important. So I think Josephine suffered from that as well, that she just really didn't matter. She was overshadowed. She wanted to be overshadowed by Wyatt because she didn't want the scandal, and she also felt that somehow her story would not seem important.
I think one of the things you say what you will about Wyatt and Josephine, it struck me as unusual. This is kind of the end of that era of Victorian domesticity. And say what you will about either one of them, over 40 years, they had a hell of a ride.
They did.
And how do you square that with the woman she is toward the end of her life, where she's kind of pugnacious and defensive and paranoid, and yet, as a young woman, it seems like she had the time of her life?
Most of her bravery went out the window when Wyatt died. I think she drew strength from him. She gave strength to him. They were a couple in that way. And I think once Wyatt died, She felt undefended and adrift. I also think she suffered from real paranoia and probably dementia towards the end of her life. But I think she didn't have a center. She didn't have a focus. Right after Wyatt died, her sister, who had been her other great supporter and the other most important person in her life, her sister died as well. So it was a double loss within a very short period of time. It's interesting, at the end of her life, she would walk around when she was living with those Earp relatives and working on the memoir. She would walk around with this big pocketbook, and in it she would have a little bit of money wrapped in toilet paper, and then she would have these yellowed clippings that she would take out and show you. But they actually weren't clippings about Wyatt Earp. They were clippings about her sister, who had become a very successful businesswoman in Oakland, California, and quite a society lady. And Josephine was incredibly proud of her. So that's why the title, Lady of the OK Corral, is in part an homage to how she felt about her sister, because part of Josephine wanted that respectability, wanted to feel that somehow, she too could be a society lady. The other part of her wanted to be out in the desert with Wyatt. So she had those two parts of her character. Does that address your question?
Let me ask you a somewhat loaded question then, okay? Now, it's an interesting thing that we attempt as scholars and biographers. You want to get inside the heads of the figures that you're writing about, because you want to understand the world as they understood it. And there's a degree of sympathy that you want to bring to this figure that you're writing about, I imagine, most of the time. But yet at the same time, as scholars, there's also a dispassionate distance that we can maintain. Now, here's where I'm going with all this. My first book revolved around a murder trial, an infamous murder trial in World War II Los Angeles, Sleeping Bear murder trial. There were 20 kids who were convicted for the murder of one. And I wanted to write the story. I wanted to write their story, not what the press had made out to these guys, but their story. And so I wrote sympathetically, I wrote passionately, and I to this day I believe that they were innocent. And I tried to show my book why they were innocent and why they were convicted. That being said, I have to concede that if I could go back in time, I wouldn't want to hang out with anyone. So here's my question I want to ask you. If you could go back in time, where do you think you would be in that circle of people in Josephine's life? Would you think you would be an intimate? Would you be on the periphery? How do you think you would have gotten along with her? I mean, I know that you fell in love with her as a historical figure.
I'm afraid you won't want to read my book if I tell you the real answer. Do you want to hear the real answer? Yeah. The real answer is that in Tombstone, the person I would most want to meet is Clara Spaulding Brown, who was the reporter. Her husband was a mining engineer, and she was writing for the San Diego newspaper, and I found her absolutely fascinating. So in Tombstone, I would certainly want to hang out with Josephine, but then I think the person I would really want to talk to is Clara Spaulding Brown. In Nome, there was an extraordinary writer who's totally obscure today named Elizabeth Robbins, who was there trying to find her brother, who was a missionary who had gone to Alaska, and her diaries are fantastic. And so I'm afraid in Nome, after I figured out what Josephine was up to, I'd want to be checking out Elizabeth Spaulding Brown as well. And I think the reason is that I don't think at the end of the day, Josephine was a very self-reflective, self-aware kind of person. I think she was defended, and I think she had a sort of pugnacious, we're going to move forward kind of personality. But I don't think that she had that quality of introspection that it is the perspective that were you in that place, those would be the people you would choose as friends. What do you think? Yeah, I mean, I think that's the difference.
Yeah, and again, it's an interesting thing. And you write sympathetically about her in a way that as a reader, you finish this book and you feel that you've gotten to know her. And I want to say this again, this was no easy thing. She was a very complicated individual. And there are many facets about her and you present this almost 360 view of this woman. You don't apologize for her, but at the same time, it's very clear that you care about her and you want to tell her story in a way that does justice to her. So I applaud you for that, but at the same time, I do recognize you're a human being. And she had her qualities as well, and I just wondered if you'd given any thought to whether you would have had lunch with her one day to hang out, or whether you would have kept your distance. I think I would have kept my distance. That's where I'm going with all of it.
Yeah, I definitely would have wanted to hang out with her, but I think it would have had a moment where I would have been looking at my watch thinking, I think it's time to go now.
Just ask, just in deference to the setting here, you know, at the beginning of this, A.K. Jacobs, at the beginning of this book, Living Biblically, he says he always thought of himself as Jewish in the same way that Olive Garden is an Italian restaurant. The reason I said it's you read a lot about the Ilfelds and the Steinfelds and the great Jewish merchant families and these great, fortunes that were made, and you people tend to forget that really much of the success of a lot of these communities that we know now in the West were because of Jewish merchants and businessmen who came in and became the cultural leader of these towns. But Josephine doesn't fit. She's a different part of the Jewish story that we don't see. And I wonder if you could just know enough about her to generalize just how she saw herself as part of a cultural and religious community, or did, for that matter.
She really didn't. I mean, as you say, the West was in part, and this is true of Alaska as well, a lot of the early business interests, had significant Jewish involvement. In Tombstone, there was a Tombstone Hebrew Benevolent Association. In Nome, in crazy Nome, they had Jewish New Year's services in the fall of 1900. Josephine did not belong to any of those communities. And I thought about this especially in terms of Tombstone, because during that period of time when she left Johnny Meehan and was adrift in Tombstone, could she have found some comfort and some support in the Jewish community? She probably could have. But Josephine had a very loose Jewish affiliation. She never hid that she was Jewish, but she wasn't particularly proud of it either. She just didn't really identify with it. Wyatt actually had more Jewish friends than Josephine did. And the family's Jewish identity was already framed before Josephine even left home. Her sister married a Unitarian. Her brother had no Jewish identity, and one generation later, there was pretty much nobody left who had much of a Jewish identity. There is one story about Wyatt having gone to a Seder. And I always had this mental image of him putting down his gun and putting on a kippah, which, there's no evidence that he did that. Just in my mind, he did. So she did not have a strong Jewish identity at all, and yet, at this great crisis in her life, when Wyatt dies, she turns back to her Jewish roots and brings Wyatt back to a Jewish cemetery. So there was something in there that there was that flame that she eventually came back to.
Go to you guys. Before you came today, I thought before you came today, I thought there was a battle at the opening I understand the alley next to the Corral. But was there a battle? Is that a legitimate? Is the story that goes with that legitimate?
The question is, was there really a gunfight at the OK Corral? There really was a gunfight at the OK Corral. Four on one side, four on the other side. And, you know, I've often wondered why this gunfight was the one that we all remember. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, even the symmetry of four on one side, four on the other. And when you think about characters like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, and you know, they really were huge personalities. So yeah, there's no getting around the fact that there really was a gunfight in the OK Corral, and it happened in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of everybody going out about their business. Suddenly there was this shootout, and there, you know, three dead bodies afterwards. So it was really pretty extraordinary.
You mentioned reading the letters of Josephine. What years were those letters written?
There's a handful of letters from the 1900s, and then as you go forward in chronology, there are more and more. So a handful from the 1900s, you know, 1903 or so, 1903 to maybe 1910. Then a lot more in the teens, and the majority of them are in the 20s.
I was under the impression that she came from a family.
Wrong. She did not come from a wealthy family, and they were not German. And I just think that's important, given everything I've tried to say about the stratification in the Jewish community. It's important to understand, number one, that they were not wealthy, and number two, that they were from the wrong side of the Jewish tracks.
Also, excuse me, was the strange ones in these HMS pinafores would be performed this weekend, this is not possible. But I have two questions, basically. Do you know how Wyatt happened to was allowed to be buried in the Jewish cemetery? And also, can we have a little idea of the real Wyatt as opposed to the legend?
So when I met with the fellow who is the head of the Hills of Eternity Cemetery in Colma, I said, you know, the Jewish cemeteries I'm familiar with, you wouldn't be buried, A, if you weren't Jewish, and B, if you were cremated. To which he sort of shrugged and said, it's California. So all I can tell you is they have a different set of rules at the Hills of Eternity Cemetery, and, you know. So, you know, real Wyatt versus the legend of Wyatt. So Wyatt did have a violent side to him. There's no getting around that. He was he was handy with a gun, and there were at least 3 people that he had a very close part in killing, if not pulling the actual trigger himself, and he probably did pull the actual trigger himself. Josephine was much more interested in portraying the domesticated side of Wyatt. When they lived in Alaska, they had a rooftop garden. And he loved to putter around the garden, according to Josephine. He could also bake a mean lemon pie. So, you know, these are the sides of Wyatt that she wanted us to know about. But the one characteristic that the people were loyal to Wyatt for his whole life, and I think that's really important to stress. People like William S. Hart and Tom Nix, people like that Masterson, Tasker Odie, who was the governor of Nevada or Arizona, Nevada. There were people who really stayed loyal to Wyatt. William S. Hearst, her senior. These were people who really admired Wyatt Earp, and there were many things they admired about him, but one of them was what they saw as his courage, that he was a person of great resoluteness and great courage. That's where the two myths converge, because I think Josephine saw him that way as well. You guys may want to comment on that.
I should say, again, this is all part of the complexity of doing biography. Is on the one hand, you're absolutely right, you've got Wyatt Earp, who was a lawman in his capacity, had to carry out what he did. Perhaps not had to, but did what it was. But at the same time, that wasn't all there was to him. There was this complete other side, and other side said plural, right? And this is what Josephine wanted to bring in as well. So I want to applaud you. That's one of the things that I appreciate about this book is that there was a more holistic understanding of Wyatt that I also received from reading your manuscript, and that some of the imagery that we have floating around in their popular culture.
I have a question. Can you hear me? I don't think the phone, the mic is on. If she wanted respect and to be accepted, and so on, more uphold that in their communities. People did get married, and she was not married to the first man she was with. No, she was married because no, she wasn't married. So she ran away from home. She took up with somebody, and then Wyatt. So she wasn't. So she was a married woman. She was single. She didn't marry him, and there were moral folks there. People did get married. And I feel like she took off her Jewish like it's a piece of dirt on the earth. And I don't respect her.
So I'll allude to what you just spoke about. Our departure from San Francisco and looking out the sea, and when she left me and went to be in the decision board, I've always heard stories of her promiscuity, and that was part of how she eventually left Wyatt. And under those circumstances, same issue, she had a relationship with his brothers and their wives. How did that all kind of fit together? I assume that they accepted her, Wyatt had an exceptionally good relationship with his brothers. They all operated together, partly as you talked about, people who understand, love, and respect each other, so as a family they did. I would like to get a sense of your perception of her during that time, and is that skew her perception of the person she was in writing letters in 1900, opposed to how she wrote those letters in 1888?
So in the latter part of her marriage with Wyatt, she spent a lot of time with his brother Virgil and Virgil's wife Allie. She also spent a lot of time with James Earp. They were pretty good friends. I would say there was no love lost between Virgil's wife Allie and Josephine, especially after Wyatt died, because Allie felt that Virgil really was the hero, and that Wyatt was stealing all the thunder. And there's a certain amount of truth in that. So they accepted her, but there was grumbling about Wyatt taking the lion's share of the sort of the popular mythology. There's this question about whether Josephine was actually a prostitute or not, and there have been some things written, particularly in the last year, that purport to document that she was a prostitute. I've looked at all that research. I don't buy it. Lots of reasons why I don't buy it, factually, just in terms of the documentation. But then at the end of the day, I come back to the question that you asked me before, Eduardo, which is how do you get into somebody's head? She could have gone back home to San Francisco at any point when she was in Tombstone. She could have done that. And so my read of her character is that she would not have been a prostitute. That said, was she perfectly happy to live as a common law wife? I think for most of her life, yes, she was, and it didn't seem out of the ordinary to her because, again, that was the milieu that they lived in. And I think we have to be very careful about applying 21st century or even 20th century views to what is a very different era. So that's something I try to do a lot, is put myself more in that timeline as opposed to bring my own prejudices to it. Why they didn't get married later on, I can't answer that, except that as time went on, it must have seemed, almost as if then you would have to admit that you hadn't been married before. So why not just keep up the charade that you had always been married? And she always maintained that they were married, by the way. And maybe someday, in this time, some other historian will find documentation that they actually were married, but I've never seen it.
Can I follow up to that question very quickly? This is a question I've really dying to ask you. It revolves around what you're talking about in terms of 21st sensibilities versus, or 21st century sensibilities versus 19th century. And back to the comment you made before about taking off her Jewishness. She made comments and seems to have espoused attitudes that, to my mind, to my 21st century mind, were anti-Semitic. Is that a fair assessment of her view? Was she anti-Semitic?
No, I don't think she was anti-Semitic, but I think she had a rough streak in her and a rough tongue. So she used language that we wouldn't necessarily use. And do I cringe? Absolutely. And did I encounter a lot of what I would consider anti-Semitic attitudes towards her when I would talk to some of the people from our beloved planet Earp? Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially the whole description of her as a shrew, and I had one fellow who insisted to me that they really didn't love each other, and Wyatt was just sticking with her because he had to, and would describe her as yelling at him, Wyatt! And every time he would do that, I would just cringe. I'll tell you who it was, because I think it's just kind of a nasty little characteristic. I mean, she did not obviously have a Yiddish accent. She was born in the United States and lived there her whole life. So sorry, I just had to say.
Matt, might I just say, to follow up on that a little bit, if you're not aware of it, you make a little hint of it there aren't people today who are just casually interested in Wyatt Earp. I'll just say that, let it go.
I am a Europhile from way back. I have spent time in Tombstone. My friends live at the base of the Boot Hill, and the daughter works at the Kirschner. And I've been down in Corral, and saw all the reenactments. I just love the story of him. And thank you for writing the story of Josephine. I read the book, and as soon as I came out, I had it because I loved the story. And I think she's pretty spunky. She left early. She did what she did down there and do stuff, and they don't know Jewish people down there. When I was down there, and I went to homes with people that were raised there for way back, I was introduced to Mrs. Lambertian. She's Jewish, and everybody stared at me all evening because they didn't know Jewish. So I think that she probably played that now. I got a feeling way back then they weren't into it either, because I was there more recently than that time. Now, have you been connected with the Earps that live here in town at all? Did you talk with him? You didn't have anything to do with him? Oh, I was just wondering if you had anything to offer. You guys? Yes. Yeah. Well, I know that. And I just wondered if we had a connection to get more information. But I love the story, and my hoping when I get to San Francisco, I'll go see the grave. And also, I become a Kirschner file, and I'm waiting for your next one. Thank you very much.
19th century, 21st century sensibility, and men and women. It's kind of upsetting to me as a woman in the 20th, 21st century to have women judged so differently than men are judged. All of the men involved in these stories were also common law married, not just their wives. They were all sleeping around with lots of different women, prostituting, more so, I think, than the women were. And I just want to speak up that I think that she was probably as honorable or more honorable than the people she hung out with.
Josephine and I thank you. I think we should take one more question, and then I'm on New York time, so at some point I'll go face forward.
Did Josephine witness the gunfight?
I don't think she witnessed the gunfight, but she heard the shots. I mean, Tombstone is not that big a town, so everybody heard the shots, and then immediately the whistle blew from the mining company, and this whole vigilante citizen group came running, including Josephine. And so I believe she heard the gunshots. She ran to the area around there. She saw that Wyatt was standing, and he was the only guy who was standing. And then she disappeared.
So drawings or pictures of her looking out the window of the Roaring House are not correct?
I don't believe so.
That's Kate.
That's Kate. Right. Can I say how much I appreciate all the wonderful questions, and may I also say a warm and sincere thank you to my fellow panelists and to our hosts tonight. Thank you very, very much.